I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation, and it's Friday, May 15, 2015, and I'm in Middlebury, Vermont with Irwin P. Sharpe. And my first question for him is to tell us your name and spell it.
Oh, I know that. Okay. It's Irwin, I-R-W-I-N, initial P, Sharpe, S-H-A-R-P-E. I graduated from the University of Michigan in engineering, mechanical engineering. This was in 1942, right after we went to war. At that time, engineers were in big demand. And I must have had at least a half a dozen job offers, and I went to work with the General Electric Company. I was with them they have a training program where you spend several months in different parts of GE, and then you decide where you want to work. So I worked on air conditioning equipment, on steam turbines, on large motors and generators, on industrial control equipment, and then I then went to work with the air conditioning department. And the first project I had was I was a member of a team that tried to solve a problem for the Army Air Corps. The Army Air Corps had a fighter plane called the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was one of the main fighter in the air. There was an Army Air Corps then. It wasn't a separate Air Corps, as you know. The P-47 had a problem in that it could only fly to a certain height, and the German Messerschmitt could fly quite a bit higher and come down on them. And that was a big problem. So I think Republic Aircraft was the manufacturer. They developed a supercharger, a turbo supercharger, and it required an intercooler to cool the hot gases that went through it. Anyway, that wasn't working. It was failing, the intercooler was. And since the air conditioning department, their responsibility is primarily heat transfer, we were given the problem, and we solved it. And after we solved it, I didn't, of course this was a whole team, and it was actually the research lab, the GE research lab, where they had the metallurgists actually solve the problem. We gave them the information that helped them do it. After that, I applied for a commission in the Navy. And just as I was doing it, my boss at GE said, I want you to go up to Schenectady, which is the GE headquarters. There's going to be a presentation there about a project that I want you to listen to. You might be interested in that. So I did. I went up to Schenectady, and I went into a small auditorium with about 40 GE engineers. And we sat down, nobody knowing what this was all about. And finally, an Army officer gets on the podium. I think it was a colonel with his eagles here and a lot of stuff on his chest. He said, I'm here to invite some of you to join us in a project which, if it is successful, will end the war. And that's all he would tell us. And I'm going to invite some of you to join. And I was one who they invited to join. I said, well, I can't. I have an application in for a commission in the Navy. They said, oh, we know about that. if it comes through, it takes them a long time, and you want to go, we'll let you go. So, okay, sounded like fun. So I accepted, and I filled out a form for the FBI, and they took a couple of weeks to investigate me, which I know they did because I got phone calls of people and relatives all over the country. Hey, what's going on? Why is the FBI after you? At any rate, I was told, after a couple of weeks of that, I was told to report for work at 233 Broadway, which is the Woolworth building in New York City, to an office on the 5th floor. And that was it. So I dutifully reported to the 5th floor, and I walked into this office, and there's this guy sitting there with a big cigar in his mouth. He was an elderly guy, must have been about 40. I was about 23 or 22 at the time. So he introduced himself. His name was Herb Rose. He had come there from Westinghouse. And he sat me down, and he said, "You know what we're doing here, don't you?" I said, "I haven't got the slightest idea." He said, "Well, we're trying to separate the light isotope of uranium." Wow. I knew what that was because in my senior year at college, I had read a Time magazine article about splitting the atom. So here I was. So, okay, great. What do we do now? I was in what they call the special pump section, and he was the head of it at the time. He told me that he explained what the setup was down in a place called Oak Ridge, where the actual separation was going to be done. And there was another building which they called the conditioning building, where everything that went into the main building had to be treated with pure fluorine before they could put it in, because if they didn't, the gas used in the main building was uranium hexafluoride, which was very corrosive, and everything had to be coated beforehand. And it was important in the conditioning building mainly that everything, the pumps, these special pumps, be clean. And I mean clean. They had to be, if you know what a dirty machine shop looks like, as many of them were at the time, we had to find a company, have them set up a clean room separate from the main room, and make sure that every part that went into the pump was degreased and cleaned, and the workmen wore gloves and white smocks. So this was really one of the first of the clean rooms. In the case of the pump for the conditioning building, the important thing was that it didn't leak, but it wasn't, no leakage was, there were all kinds of leakage. When I say that, I mean compared to the pump that went into the main building, there the leakage was measured in what they called micron cubic feet an hour. And it was only like a few micron cubic feet an hour. A micron is 1,000th of a millimeter, but I better not get into all that. So we had to develop, first we had to find pump manufacturers, but a lot of that work had been done before I got there. And Herb had several manufacturers in mind, and actually had signed a contract with, by the time I was there a short while, he had signed a contract, or at least Kellex did, with two companies. The B. Truss Company in Brooklyn, they were to make the pump for the main building, and the F.J. Stokes Company in North Philadelphia, They were to make the pump for the conditioning building. But the job was still to design the seals. The big problem was the leakage along the shaft that went from the motor to the internal part of the pump. And these seals had to be, they were very complicated, and I think the basic design was done by Herb Rose. His job at Westinghouse involved high vacuum equipment, so he was able to do it. My experience in tight systems was in air conditioning, but this was much tighter than was required in air conditioning. So he designed most of that seal, and shortly after that he was promoted. Meantime, we were adding people to the special pump section. And eventually you got to, I think, 16 or 18 people. I don't really remember exactly how many. But about that point, Herb was promoted to another job. I didn't know what it was, and I took his place as the section engineer for the special vacuum pump division. So we arranged with each of these companies to build these clean rooms for assembling pumps. With Beach Rust, where it was extremely important, they set aside a whole section of their plant, sealed it off, and put in degreasing equipment and cleaning equipment, and dressed the workmen who really thought this was very funny in white smocks and gloves and so on, to make sure everything was clean. Not even a thumbprint on any piece of equipment. And then I assigned 2 men to stay there and make sure that this is exactly what happened. They were very cooperative, however, and we had no problems there. With Stokes, it was a similar situation. We set up a clean room for them. They thought this whole thing was crazy, with these bunch of college kids coming in here and telling us how to do this, but they did it. And again, I had 1 or 2 guys spend time there full time to make sure that they did what they were supposed to do, and they did. There were no problems with either company, both very cooperative. In the meantime, I traveled to Oak Ridge several times to see where the pumps. The first time down to Oak Ridge, the big K-25 building, which is that big U-shaped building that everyone is familiar with, I guess, the construction was being completed for it. And you could stand in that building and look down it with nothing in it, and all the walls just seemed to converge like that. It was pretty impressive, and 4 stories high. The conditioning building was a pretty large building too, but not nearly the size of the K-25 building. So we had one of the main problems, this is interesting, I think. We didn't know what this light isotope of uranium, U-235, was going to be used for. We knew what it could be used for, but nobody told us officially what it was going to be used for. But we pretty well, in talking among ourselves, had it figured out, but no one ever confirmed it, no one ever talked about it. So, one of the main problems I remember being talked about was the fact that here's this building almost completed, and the main equipment, which was the diffusers, which was to do the separating of the U-235 from the U-238, were not working yet. And everybody was wondering what's going to happen if it doesn't work. There was constant activity between Columbia University with John Dunning, as I remember it, and some of the other people in Columbia, and the scientists in our building, and we had most of I might point out, if I hadn't said it earlier, that most of the engineering for that Oak Ridge K-25 plant particularly was done from the Woolworth building. And this is where the scientists and engineers were all located. So we had a constant parade of people in and out. So we knew what was going on without being told what was going on. We kept working on our part of it, and we had our own problems. One of them I remember was the first pump at the Beach Rust Company, which was the one that had this very complicated special shaft seal, was completed and was being tested. And I was in my office in a Woolworth building, and I had several men at Beach Rust. When my phone rang, and one of them says, that seal is no damn good. It leaks like a sieve. We can't even pull a vacuum on that pump. Great. So I got on my horse, which was the subway system in New York, went over to Brooklyn and walked into the plant, and they were all standing around there with long faces. And I said, where does it leak? So I don't know. We can't pull a vacuum on it. So I said, okay, let's do it the old-fashioned way. We'll put compressed air in it and dump the whole thing in that big tank of water and see where it leaks. So they put compressed air in. They brought a crane in. They dumped the whole pump into this big tank, and the water bubbled. It was all coming from the casting around the seal. When we suddenly realized that that was stupid. Well, it was partly stupid. We shouldn't have used a casting, because castings can be porous. But you couldn't get a forged, this had to be brass or bronze. All of the forged brass or bronze was owned by the Navy. It was used for shafting for the ships, primarily the naval ships. We couldn't touch it. But General Groves had I don't remember what the priority was. He had the priority for anything. So they assigned an expediter to us, a guy by the name of McAllister, I remember. Again, an elderly guy. He was about 40. And he went out in a couple of days. He had located some bronze, forging, had gotten it from out of the Navy and brought it over to Beach Rust. And they machined the grooves and the things that were necessary out of this forged bronze, or bronze. And we tried that in the pump, and that was fine. No problem. It didn't leak. So that part was okay. And they continued to make the pumps. I might mention we had a laboratory over in Jersey City under the stadium, where we initially tested some of these pumps that came through. But so I would go to Jersey City every now and then, and down to Oak Ridge and New York. That was my circuit. And in the meantime, I think they got the barrier problem solved. And they started, I think Chrysler Corporation was making the barrier, the diffuser. And then they started making them. And they were getting ready to deliver them. And we delivered the first Stokes pump, which was for the conditioning building, to the conditioning building. And I had one of my men down there to be there when I got there. And then I got a telephone call, and it wasn't from my man, it was from someone higher up. He said, "Those pumps are dirty. You're holding everything up. You've got to get those pumps clean." I said, "They're clean. I know they're clean." Well, he said, "All the oil that we put in it is carbonizing." I said, "Well, there must be something wrong with your oil." "It can't be. This is a special oil that was flown over from England for this purpose, and we're paying $2,000 a gallon for it. It's not the oil, it's your pump. Get them clean." So I got on my other horse, which was a DC-3 at a LaGuardia airport, and flew down to Oak Ridge. And I looked at the pump, and they were right, it was all carbonized. And I said to the chemist there, "Well, let's check the oil. There's nothing wrong with the oil. Get those pumps clean." And they were giving me hell. "Look, everything's being held up." So I had my fellow who was down there from my staff, a fellow by the name of Troxler, I can't remember his first name. He had been there a month and had made friends with everybody. Very nice guy. So I said, "Look, get me 3 beakers. 2 of them out of cast iron. You can take a piece of pipe and weld a bottom to it. And the 3rd one out of glass, out of the chem lab. Clean, chemically clean, the glass one and one of the cast iron ones. And the other cast iron one, smear some grease in there. And get me a little bit of oil. I want to put a little bit of oil in each beaker. And make a manifold, a pipe with 3 prongs to it, 1 over each beaker." What I was trying to do is to get some fluorine. The chem lab wouldn't let me have any. So we traced at least they didn't want me messing around with it. So Troxler and I traced the lines in the conditioning building, the valves, back to the fluorine plant. And I don't know how we did it, we were probably crazy, but we opened enough valves so this conditioning building had all the spuds in the floor, waiting to be, for the pumps to be attached to them with valves on each one. So we had one of them, and we got the fluorine, we thought, to 1 spud, and we set these 3 beakers up under it and put the manifold in it. And as we were doing it, people were gathering around, and that was not good. And I didn't want to open the valve. And then a couple of MPs come walking and said, "What's going on here?" I said, "Soldier, get these people back." "Yes, sir." And they pushed everyone back. And after they got them back, I cracked this valve, and the fluorine came through, and the smoke puffed out, and we turned to close the valve, and all 3 beakers were carbonized. The dirty beaker, the clean cast iron beaker, and the clean glass beaker. It had to be the oil. And we got the chemists in and we showed it to them. Well, they moved real fast after that. They called England, they reformulated the oil, and in less than a week, they flew a new shipment back, and they tried that on another pump, and that was okay. So those are the 2 near catastrophes that I can't forget. But the interesting thing about the whole project is that everything was done in series. We never knew whether the step ahead was going to work until it was tried. So it took a lot of guts to build, to do what they did there, not knowing whether it was going to work. So at any rate, we shipped all the pumps, and or they started shipping. And then I went down to Oak Ridge shortly after they started up the plant. I think they started in January or February of 1945. And I went down in March, which was for the time when they were going to use these beach rest pumps to sample the effluent and find out what was happening. And when I got there and they had done it, we learned that they were getting separation and everything seemed to be working just fine. And this was toward the latter part of March of 1945. And I was anxious to get back home because my first child was about to be born. And I did. I got there a couple of days before he was born. I still didn't know what this stuff was going to be used for, although we knew, but we were never told officially. And then toward the end of the project, I remember, or to the end of shipping the pumps, still had a lot to ship, but we had we were told there was an urgent meeting for us up at the conference room on the X floor in the Woolworth building. I don't remember the floor. And there would be a group of people from a place called Los Alamos were going to be there, and they wanted to talk to us. Well, we had heard about a place called Los Alamos. We never really knew what they were doing there. We just kind of guessed, but anyway, we didn't know. Anyway, the half a dozen of these guys are sitting around a conference table when in the company of Herb Rose, who's the guy who I reported to initially, and Rollo Powers and I walked into the conference room. And these guys are sitting around a table and talking, and we greeted each other. And they said, one of them with a very strong Hungarian accent, whose name we learned later was Edward Teller, said, the pumps that you are making toward and he mentioned the part of the end of the plant, they have to be coated with another metal. Now, I'm sure it may not be secret, but I won't mention the metal. And we have to have at least 1/8 of an inch coating across the entire pump. So Herb Rose, with a cigar in his mouth, says, "Doctor, I'm a farm boy from Kansas. Please tell me why we have to cut this with 1/8 of an inch of this metal." And Dr. Teller says, well, toward the end of the plant, if you get, these pumps were they were horizontal pumps. They're about that high. You get a couple of workmen standing there with their feet on it, the human body emits neutrons. And if the solid angle of these neutrons is whatever the key number was, this whole thing could go boom. So Herb says, "Thank you, Dr. Teller." Well, we went back and we found a company that made metal spraying equipment where you feed a wire into a hot gun and it sprays molten metal. And we had wire made of this material, this metal, and we put about 1/4 of an inch, in some cases 3/8 of an inch, not 1/8, around these pumps. We were taking no chances. And it didn't blow up, so I guess we were all right. And then I guess we were getting to the end of the project, I thought. And then one July day, I was in the subway. I left my office in a Woolworth building. I was going home. And across the aisle from me, this person holds up the New York Times backward. I could see the front page. And it says, atomic bomb dropped in Japan. That was the first I really knew about it officially. Wow, I went out and I bought several copies of the Times. And I dashed home. Oh, I didn't tell you that through all this, my wife didn't know what I was doing. This was a secret, and she accepted it. And I dashed up to where she was. She had the baby in a, you know what a bassinet is, I assume. These guys don't here, but anyway, she had the baby in a bassinet. And I said, this is what I've been working on. And I showed her the Times. And she dropped, and she picked up the paper, and he started gurgling. So we picked him up, and then we went on from there. He made it. He's doing fine. Kellex had designed and had made a gold key. And it was to be given to about 100 of what they considered to be the key men on the K-25 project. And by some, I don't know why, but anyway, I was one of them. And I was invited to the dinner, given the key at the dinner. And at the dinner were all of these great scientists and military people that I had met casually on and off, and I was able to shake their hand, like General Grove and Katie Nichols and Manson Benedict. Manson Benedict, I should say a word about him. Manson was a physicist, an extremely nice guy, and probably the guy that was most responsible for the success of that K-25 project. He knew all the answers. He did was responsible for most of the design, and he followed up. He would appear in my office every now and then and just sit down and we'd chat. He didn't give the appearance of questioning me. We just talked. And he probably let me know if there's ever a problem, to be sure to let him know he might be able to help. I didn't know who he was, except what his name was at the time. I learned later who he was. And of course he was there, and M.W. Kellogg, and P.C. Keith, the president of Kellex, Dobie Keith, and Arnold and Baker and the whole... Anyway, the Woolworth building had, I won't say most, but many of the key men, really, the key men for that K-25 and really the Oak Ridge project. So that was the Kellex key. The Kellex key symbolizes the great service and high faith of all those who dreamed and labored through the years 1943 to 45 on the K-25 project, which hastened the end of the war. It is awarded to key personnel of the Kellex Corporation and certain members of the U.S. Army and other organizations closely associated with the Kellex project, in lasting recognition of their professional and personal contributions to the vital task. The key itself, of which only a limited number have been struck, was designed by the Kellex staff. The concentric rings represent the orbit of electrons around the nucleus. The crossed lightning, forming a KX for Kellex, stands for the forces unleashed by the interlocking of the atom. And this has the names of all those who attended it. It's in that. Oh, and this is the menu.
Ha
Okay.
Well,
so
why don't you read the dessert? Tell them what you had for dessert.
Oh, I generally like to eat the dessert. Okay, we had Bombay Praline Atomic.
Was it good?
Right. Must have been good.
Great.
And then it's the
Yeah.
back.
And the back is inscribed to him.
It has my name on it, and it says the Kellex Corporation, Atomic Bomb, 1943 to 1945. And this is
Yes.
Dobie Keith, P.C. Keith. He was the president of Kellex.
Can you say why is he looking like a
Well, his
Madman.
reputation was he wanted things done, and he wanted it done. Well, they both did. This is Al Baker, who was the operating guy. We want it done, and we want it done now.
So you met John Dunning. Can you tell
I
us
just
about
met him at the dinner. I saw him dashing in and out of the Woolworth building. He was at Columbia University, but he was practically commuting to the Woolworth building because he was one of the guys working on the diffuser on the barrier.
So other than Dunning, how much did you collaborate with the Columbia University folks?
I personally didn't collaborate with them at all. My job was getting these special pumps, and that was it, really, and some other pieces of equipment, but primarily the special pumps.
So do you think organizationally the project worked well?
It must have. It did. It was, you have to keep in mind that nobody knew what was going to work and what wasn't going to work right from when they started building it. All the scientists, the physicists, the chemists knew was the theory. They had done a little bit of work. I think, what's his name, Fermi at the University of Chicago, and Urey, but they had never gone from a laboratory to full-blown production. And typically the big manufacturers, the important manufacturers of refineries and chemical plants didn't normally go from the laboratory to a full-blown project. They had something in between. But this went from the lab to full-blown, and each step, you never knew whether it was going to work, and they never knew. But when there was a problem, they got it solved. Each problem got solved, and people just kept working at it. It was so. To answer your question about organization, I can't answer that one because I don't know enough about the whole organization. But I do know that things got done. When we needed something, we got it. And everybody was working. There was nothing like the backbiting, at least that I knew of, that you see in other organizations. We all had, you open the New York Times every day, and there are pages and pages of fine print listing the American casualties, the wounded and the dead. And you see that every day, and you kind of feel, well, we better keep working on this. Yeah.
We were talking earlier about the project being a mix of physics and engineering. What kind of mix was that?
Well, it was the physicists and the chemists who developed the project concept, but that had to be turned into hardware. And that was an engineering job. We used to, in talking to the physicist and chemist in the Woolworth building, always in the building, never at lunch and never outside of the building, I might add. We'd kid them about, or they'd ask us, you guys going to get this thing to work? And I said, we're going to get it to work. Is it going to work? Is your theory right? And that's the way it went back and forth until it actually did work.
So we were both right.
We were both right, yeah. But I think we were right only because of the hard driving. I think Grove is the one who really deserved credit for this whole thing. I never met Oppenheimer, and I know he was extremely important in the bomb. But for the overall project, to give him the ammunition for the bomb, I think Grove is the guy who deserves the credit. That's my opinion of it from what I observed. So.
What about in the Woolworth building? There were some members of the British mission for a while before they shipped out to Los Alamos. Were you there when they came?
I guess I was there. I mean, Klaus Fuchs, I think, was one of them. I never met him. I didn't know him. We had heard about spies. Mostly, we were warned not to talk at lunch or if you're out in a bar or out in the street, because the spies were all over the place. But I never specifically learned about a spy while I was there. It was afterward that I did. But everybody knew about it then.
So had you heard of any one of your colleagues being approached by someone, or?
No. We were just constantly warned, keep your mouth shut.
So was your schedule a 5-day workday, or was it a 6-day?
Oh, no.
Or?
Well, it was supposed to be a 5-day workday, but we worked on Saturdays and Sundays too. And we worked late at night sometimes. And then we go out to, at night, some very nice restaurants in downtown New York. And we go out to dinner and come back and work again. But I get home very late some nights. And other nights I get home, leave at 5, 6 o'clock. So it depended on the workload at the time. But we didn't draw any line as far as hours of work. We just worked depending on the job that had to be done.
Now, New York was in a blackout situation, is that right?
Yes, they were. It was sort of a blackout. It wasn't really a blackout. I mean, the streets were never dark, absolutely dark. I guess if they had heard of any planes or anything in the area, they would have done it. But I don't recall ever being caught in the real darkness there. And I take the subway back home, and it worked.
I guess I just heard the Statue of Liberty was...
the lights were out on that, and the Empire State Building, the beacon was out, and the tower was normally lit. That was out. I mean, those things were out, but the streets were lit. When you say a blackout, they did have one when the guy hit the pole and everything went black. Some years later, New York had a big blackout, a complete blackout, and some 12-year-old kid thought he was responsible for it because he was walking down the street with a stick and he hit one of the light poles and suddenly all the lights went out. Well, that was much after the war.
That's great. Why don't you tell us about your trips to Oak Ridge? What was it? What was the security like just entering the...
Okay. Well, I'd take a plane. It was DC-3. If you've ever been on one of those, I can't stand up and I have to bend over. Or I did then. Maybe I can now. I was usually greeted at the airport by an Army car and driven to Oak Ridge. And I stayed at the guest house. I was able to bring a camera in there, provided I registered it with the military police, which I did. And I did take pictures in the town site. That was okay, but never brought the camera near what we call the job site, which was several miles away. It was dirty, it was muddy, it was dusty. When I remember walking in these buildings, I had been in factory buildings before, but never like this. GE had some pretty big buildings, but again, never like the ones they had down at Oak Ridge. The conditioning building itself was an extremely large building. And the main building, the K-25 building, as I mentioned earlier, some of the foremen and the men used to go around on bicycles and roller skates until they got the equipment installed. But when I was there the first time, there was no equipment. It was just this big empty building. And they were scooting by on bicycles and roller skates. But as I went down there, the building kept filling up. And eventually I didn't get into the building. I got into the conditioning building. But after our first pumps got installed and things got going, I didn't go near the K-25 building. Well, as I said, you had to register your camera. And on one of my quick trips down there, must have been the one where we had the problem with the oil. And I went down there in a hurry, but I automatically throw a camera in my valise. And I forgot about it. And after I was through, and I had to be driven back to the airport, I got into this Army car in the back seat between a guy who was I forget what rank of general he was, but he was a general, and a colonel. And they were talking across me like that. I don't know what they were talking about, but they were talking. And we started to drive out to the main gate. And as we got to the gate, the MPs were stopping every car, opening the trunk, and opening all the valises. And I suddenly remembered my camera and no pass for it. I said, oh boy, here it goes. So we got up to that, and I just sat there, and the MP stuck his head in the car and was about to tell him to open the trunk when he looked at who was in there. He got back and he saluted and let everybody through. You see. But they weren't saluting me. So that was luck. Otherwise, I'd still be in jail, I guess. So that was Oak Ridge. They used to ask in the town site or in Knoxville, what are these guys doing there? Well, we were told to tell them they're building the front end of horses for final assembly in Washington. So that's all theoretically that people were supposed to know. But it's true, they didn't know what was going on. We knew a lot more in a Woolworth building than they knew down at Oak Ridge.
So how many people worked in the Woolworth building? Do you have a guess about?
Well, there were 4 or 5 floors, and I was at my office was on the 5th floor, right in the front. It was a great office overlooking City Hall Park and Broadway, so I could see all the parades after the war. But so we had the 5th floor, and I think it went up 4 or 5 floors above that. So Well, I guess there were certainly from the basic of the key, there were at least 100 there, but roughly, I'd say there were several hundred people there. And then there were some who started in the Woolworth building and then went down to Oak Ridge and stayed there. But luckily, I wasn't one of them.
So you were living in Jersey City, is that right?
No, I was living in, Jersey City had a Kellex lab underneath the stadium, and that's where we tested the pumps before we released some of them, when they were first being built. So I'd go to that lab, but I was living in Queens, in Jamaica, and taking the subway to the Woolworth building.
How long a commute was that?
It was about an hour. I had started in New Jersey, in East Orange, when I was with GE, and when I got an order to report for induction, I thought I'd better get my wife out of there and moved her back with her parents in Queens. And then my induction order was canceled the weekend before, so it wasn't necessary, but that's where we were.
So you just stayed living with your parents then?
I did for a few years, and then went back to GE and built a house in New Jersey.
After the war?
After the war, right. Yeah.
So she wasn't too lonely with your working and all that?
No, she wasn't lonely, just curious.
So other than dropping the baby in the bath,
Well,
how did she react, once
well,
the
she was busy telling people, people will want to know, what's your husband doing home? Well, he's working on a special project for the Army. Well, what's the project? I don't know, except that it's a big one and he'll probably end the war if he's successful. That's all she could tell anybody. And that's all she knew. So that was it. Then I left GE and got into my own business, and I was involved in some atomic energy projects as a marketing consultant after that. Some for companies like Westinghouse, and for Canada, for the Canadian Atomic Energy Association. They were developing products to sell to our atomic energy people. So I stayed in contact with atomic energy for many years afterward, and I'd been in my own business ever since then as a consultant, but not on atomic energy necessarily, but all kinds of industrial products.
So do you ever run across an old Manhattan Project
Yes,
colleague?
I did. When I started in the consulting business, I needed a place to meet potential clients where I could impress them. And I wanted to join, there's a club in New York at the time called the Engineers Club in a beautiful building right across from Bryant Park. And I wanted to join the Engineers Club and then invite potential clients or clients to have lunch with me there, that sort of thing. But I had to know somebody who was, or two people, had to recommend me. And one of them I knew, and he was going to recommend me. And I looked through the membership list, and I see Harry Renberg. Harry Renberg, R-E-H-N-B-E-R-G. Harry was his first name. Came from Seattle. He was a construction supervisor, a real construction supervisor. He started at the Woolworth building to familiarize himself with our pumps, and then he went down to Oak Ridge and he supervised the actual installation of our pumps and lots of other stuff. Well, we knew each other quite well, and I saw his name on the listing. So I called his company and I talked to him, He said, oh, come on over, let's get reacquainted. This was about at least 5 or more than that, years afterward. So I walked in there waiting to meet Harry Renberg in the engineering department, I thought. And I walked in, and the receptionist said, well, Mr. Renberg will be with you in a minute. And I was ushered into the office of the president. That was Harry Renberg. He and I think Frank Rabel had formed a construction company to compete with M.W. Kellogg called Scientific Design. It was a big company by then. They were building oil refineries and chemical plants, and he was the president. So we sat and talked, and he recommended me, and I became a member of the Engineers Club, and I was able to invite clients to have dinner with, or lunch with me there, even dinner too, it depended. So the other members, I think I occasionally met them. I can't remember the circumstances, but that one I remember very well.
That was a very well-placed acquaintance.
Right.
Yeah, timely.
Yeah. Last time I saw him, he's sitting there at Oak Ridge behind a desk, this line of men waiting to see him, big cigar in his mouth and barking orders back and forth.
That's good.
Yeah, I think two of the other guys, I think I may have met them shortly after the war. I think it was, I can't think of the names. These were the two guys who worked on vacuum measuring equipment. They formed a company of their own after the war with a name that had vacuum into it. But it became a big company. They were listed on the New York Stock Exchange. I can't remember the name of the company at this point, but so some of these guys really made use of what they learned, and they did very well. So.
Sounds like you were quite an extraordinary group.
I think the group there was extraordinary. I was lucky to be, to be there to meet some of them, because I certainly wasn't. I just was a dumb engineer trying to figure out what was going on. See?
So do you keep up? Are you part of the IEEE or double E?
Not anymore. I was part of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, since I was a mechanical engineer. But
That's right.
I haven't kept up with that
Yeah.
either. So I got into marketing after I left GE, but it was, I formed a consulting company, and we were doing marketing and marketing research on industrial products, everything from computer chips to turbines and generators, because I knew the language, and my competition at the time were consumer companies who, when they got into that kind of research, they just didn't know how to talk to engineers, but I did. So I've been doing that ever since. Now my son is doing it, so he's head of the company now. It's still in existence.
Fabulous. I always ask this question, which is to ask, looking back, how do you feel about having been involved in the creation of the atomic bomb?
Well, that's at the time, and shortly afterward, remembering that, as I mentioned earlier, every time I opened the newspaper, which is full of pages and pages of Americans' casualties. And I had friends who were flying planes or navigating planes. I had two brothers who were over, one in Europe and one in Asia. So I didn't have any qualms about dropping the bomb. I thought it ended the war. There's been some dispute about whether it was necessary, but at the time I didn't know any better. And in thinking about it, I think it really changed the world. We haven't had a big world war because everyone's afraid of the Manhattan Project bomb ever since. We've had wars, we've had people killed. We certainly had lots of people killed, recently, but nothing like the number that were killed during World War II. So that from that standpoint, maybe it did good. But of course, right now, with what's going on with the proliferation, we don't know that. But I can remember after the war when Russia had it, and we were building a house, we were talking about building a bomb shelter as part of the house. It was common practice, and the architects knew how to do it. We never did, but that's the way we were thinking at the time. And even today, who knows? Maybe this thing will be torn up in some kind of a flash, but I hope not. So to answer your question, at the time, I thought it was the right thing to do. I still think, looking back at the time, it was the right thing to do. The problem was, we thought that we had it, and never dreamt that the Russians would get it as fast as they did.
Well, it's quite a remarkable thing to be part of.
I guess it was in retrospect. At the time, we were just working. It wasn't, once you start, even though I knew what this was about, the day-to-day work, you never thought about that. You just thought about your job and what had to be done. And it wasn't until you started thinking or sat down with a bunch of the guys and talking about it that you thought about it. But
and of course, in those days, you weren't allowed to share or talk about your work outside of work.
No, that's right. It had to be inside of work, in the office, or when we were down in Oak Ridge at the guest house with other guys, we could sit around and talk there in our room. But
So at the guest house, did you run into people then from Los Alamos or other parts of the project?
We may have. I wouldn't have known them if I saw them. I didn't know the people. The first time I met them was when the group came up to New York to the Woolworth building. And I didn't know them at the time. It was only later that and they certainly didn't know me.
So when you were at Oak Ridge, did you ride the buses or did you have a special car?
I had a car. There was always an Army car that took me somewhere. I never rode the bus. But there was a bus, I remember.
Yeah, it was a huge bus system.
Yeah, there was. But,
yeah, for the workers. But I guess you were a
right,
VIP.
Right. I wasn't a worker.
Right. Right. That's great. So you say you brought your wife down to see Oak Ridge?
After the war, I had to come down to Oak Ridge. I forgot the reason, but I got permission to drive and to bring my wife down. So we had this nice drive down through the Skyline Drive and into Virginia and then finally to Oak Ridge. And she stayed in the town side in the guest house while I worked. I was there for, I think, 2 or 3 days, and then we drove back. So it was fun. And she was remarking how dirty and dusty it still was. You see.
And that was just a few years after the war then?
Yeah, it was still dirty and dusty.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think of this new Manhattan Project National Historical Park?
Well, I think it's great. I don't know how, you're apparently doing a great job because it does exist now, doesn't it? And Congress has approved some money for it. So
well,
there you go.
It needs to go further, but
right.
we got it on the books.
You've
so
got it going.
Yeah.
I think it has to commemorate the explosive part of it, though. I mean, it killed a lot of people. it may have saved the killing of a lot of people too. But really, somehow it has to aim at what can you do for peace with it. And that's getting to be pretty difficult these days. So